Shalom Aleichem. Terre Menschen. Mein Name ist Tali Lavi. Ich bin a Schreiber und a Kritiker. Please don't be overly excited nor alarmed, for that matter, by this statement, as Yiddish hauntings in new fiction and film will not be conducted in Yiddish. But what just occurred in this room when I said those words was something that spoke out of the collapse and expansion of time and space. The words and their utterance was a consequence of exile and desire and generations and genetic fusion of trauma. And there was also the presence of joy. The labor form of Yiddish, its positioning and its potency, is at the heart of our explorations today. And now we're going to make a leap of faith because Rivki, before I am going to introduce everyone, but I was going to do the acknowledgement of country in English, but we're going to do it in Yiddish. So Rivki.
I think we'll do half-half. Is that okay? So I know some of it off the heart. So wir geben ab Covid die Erstgesessene Abhitel von dem Land, wo wir befinden sich.
I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and pay respect to their elders past and present. Sovereignty has never been ceded. Please turn off your phones or switch them to silent, and we will have a few minutes at the end for your questions, hopefully. I'm not promising anything. It is my great joy to introduce you to the three wonderful women sitting next to me, Leah Kaminsky, Rebecca Margolis, and Eleanor Reissa. Eleanor Reissa's achievements are extraordinary. A superlative storyteller in English and her Mamaloshan of Yiddish, Eleanor is an artist of many talents. To name a few, well, for those who didn't get the opportunity of listening to her take flight on stage last night, she is a prize-winning playwright whose plays appear in the anthology The Last Survivor and other modern Jewish plays, and is a Tony Award-nominated theatre director for Those Were the Days. She is an actress of Broadway and television, including for Paula Vogel's Indecent, HBO's The Plot Against America, yes, based on the Philip Roth novel, and plays the matriarch in the comedy The Zweiflers, about a German Jewish family which won Best Series at the Cannes Series Awards earlier this year. Eleanor has sung in Carnegie Hall and is an internationally renowned Yiddish singer who was artistic director of the Volksbein Theatre. She is currently host of a podcast titled Those Who Were There, Voices of the Holocaust. And in 2022, her powerful The Letters Project, A Daughter's Journey emerged, a moving exploration of Eleanor's family history, an encounter with the terrible legacy of the Shoah, and a reappraisal of her own story in the wake of her discoveries. Professor Rebecca Margolis, who you will hear me calling Rivki, is the Pratt Foundation Chair of Jewish Civilization at ACJC at Monash University, where she has been working since 2020. An exemplary thinker, educator, and communicator, Rebecca was formerly at the University of Ottawa in Canada. She has published 3 books, Jewish Roots, Canadian Soil, Yiddish Cultural Life in Montreal from 1905 till 1945, Yiddish Lebt, Yiddish Lives On, Journeys of Language Revitalization. This, her latest, The Yiddish Supernatural on Screen, Dibbuks, Demons and Haunted Jewish Pasts, is a masterful work. Rivki is a relatively new treasure to our community and has recently served as Yiddish translator and dialogue coach for the recent groundbreaking production of Yentl and a very Jewish Christmas carol. I'm looking forward to her being a grounding presence in this otherworldly session. Leah Kaminsky might be dabbling in a bit of dark magic herself, for she is both a family physician, a GP, and an award-winning writer. I'm thinking of the quote from Michael Wex in Rivki's book, where he talks about, I can't even say the word, apotropaic formulas, which is all don't worry, and practices, which we might speak about later, but we probably won't. In other words, Leah, have you worn something red today?
No.
Yes, you've got, it's all right. Her debut novel, The Waiting Room, won the Voss Literary Prize and unforgettably told a story that fanned out into many stories about lives inhabited by histories past, recent and unfolding, all colliding in a tale of a young doctor from Melbourne who is living in Haifa at the time of deadly terrorist attacks. About her next novel, The Hollow Bones, Kate Forsyth proclaimed it to be a slow, melancholy, magic realist novel that reflects on the nature of complicity and the very purpose of life. Her non-fiction work, We're All Going to Die, confronts death through the framework of celebrating life. Among other works, Leah's collection of poetry stitching things together was a finalist in the Anne Elder Poetry Award. Leah's latest novel, The Hypnotic Doll's Eye, was published last year. It holds us in its eerie and beguiling grasp and features a fictionalised version of legendary Yiddish poet and essayist Melech Ravitch. Please warmly welcome Eleanor, Rebecca and Leah. Before I enter the terrain of hauntings and the haunted, I'd like you all to ask you all to tell us about your earliest encounter with Yiddish.
My parents were Holocaust people, and that was the language at home. I had one set of grandparents that survived, and so Yiddish was my first language. That was where I first encountered it, and it wasn't until later when I started doing theater and singing that it really improved enormously. And now it's about as good as my English, which isn't necessarily saying that much.
Rivki.
I'm a native German speaker, and I moved to Canada at the age of 3, and my family, as a Jewish family migrating from Germany, looked for people who could communicate with their 3-year-old daughter and help teach her English. And so I was exposed to Yiddish speakers who were my grandmother's friends, had a Canadian grandmother. So I remember being told Mach mit die Fies in swim classes, and to my mind, I could not distinguish really between Yiddish and German. They were both sort of languages that floated around. German was the one I spoke, and Yiddish was the one that the people I really loved spoke in my grandmother's community. And then I learned some Yiddish in school without really thinking about it much. And then in university, I needed an easy credit. And I found a Yiddish literature class and thought this would be easy. I know Yiddish, and I fell in love with the literature. So I've been studying it as sort of, I consider myself a new learner of Yiddish. I've been just working really hard at paying homage to the Yiddish culture by learning the language as best I can and exploring it as much as I'm able.
Wow, I feel like a bit of a schlepper here. I grew up speaking Yiddish at home. My grandfather, who'd come after the war, only spoke Yiddish, my little grandfather. And I spent, they sent me to Sholem Aleichem Shul and to kindergarten and blah, blah, blah. And so I spent most of my childhood speaking Yiddish, and then at a certain point felt, shemzich. I felt really embarrassed to be speaking Yiddish. I just wanted to be an Aussie chick. And so I walked away from that, even though my parents spoke Yiddish at home. They spoke Polish if they didn't want us to understand. And then, you spend I think you spend your adult life trying to recapture what you ran away from when you were a child. And so Yiddish for me, it's very much part of my neshama. And I sort of, Geraldine Brooks writes about the meaning of the word haunting. I think she mentioned it in a Boyer lecture, and it comes from the Old Norse, someone correct me if I'm wrong, which is hemta, which means to bring home. So the haunting brings us home, and I think all those years where I ran away from my heritage, the voices, the Yiddish whispers haunted me, and that, I think, coming back to the Yiddish brought me home and brought me back. You were talking last night about you talk to the dead, and the whispers are all in Yiddish.
I want to also, I love that idea of the haunting, because I want to talk about unheimlich, like through this, the idea of the haunting, the uncanny. But first, I'm glad you went there, and you said there was some shift. And what I want to know from Eleanor was what your relation to Yiddish was in the public domain growing up, how you felt about it, and maybe when you came to it again on your own terms, there was something, maybe it resonated in a different way to what you thought it was to begin with?
Very much like Leah, ich was geschämt. I was embarrassed, I was ashamed. My name in the theater is Eleanor Reissa, not Eleanor Schlisselberg. So Eleanor Schlisselberg is my name. So I ran away from that because it was too Jewish. And this way I thought people would think I was Italian, and that was an improvement. So it took a while before I accepted what I was and Yiddish, and but it's shifted completely. I love to speak Yiddish. My Yiddish is pretty good. Grammar, not always so much. I love this community here in Melbourne that seems to still be in the world that my family once occupied. And I think, I suspect you know how rich you are in that regard, but I'm rather impressed at this. Yiddish is all over me. I mean, it's all over. Anything I can do in Yiddish, I do. Yeah.
What strikes me about what you said, Rivki, because I didn't know this about you, so you came to another country and you were German. You would have been the German girl probably for a bit. And maybe it was, you might not have had that sense of shame because you came to it from an other to another other, and it was a beloved other. I find it quite beautiful. Anyway, I'm not going to start crying now. We've got time. Yeah. That makes sense in terms of your scholarship as well. Rivki's book should come with a warning, and it's not about the dangers of being possessed, because after you read it, you want to find a cave somewhere and download or watch every single film and series, and then you will want to read the books that you've cited, some of them from, there are quotes from Isaac Bashevis Singer and Michael Wex, so probably know of those. And then there's all the scholarly articles, and it's actually, so it's quite angst written in that sense. But you quote the scholar and translator Anita Norwich, and she writes about Yiddish as the language of the majority of Holocaust victims, which has increasingly become a metonymy for them, as if it constituted the very shrouds they were denied. She says it's a sign of absence. Can you talk to us a little bit about this?
So there's a lot of theoretical material you can imagine about why people after the Holocaust engage with Yiddish and what it means when you open your mouth and a Yiddish word comes out. Everybody wants to know why. And it's interesting in this city, especially being on this panel right now, where there are people for whom Yiddish was a natural outpouring of their upbringing and their family legacy. That's not the case for most of the people coming to Yiddish now who are the learners. So the university students who are gravitating really in impressive numbers to Yiddish. Some Jewish, some non-Jewish, different backgrounds. Most of them don't have any Yiddish in their families. And Yiddish for them is a space of alterity. It's a space of non-hegemonic culture. It's a space of the left. It's a space of excitement and vibrancy, but it's not a space of family. So Anita Norwich's observation is really interesting because she's looking at her own connection with Yiddish as a writer, as a scholar, as a child of survivors, as a Yiddish activist who's been very, very active promoting Yiddish and introducing scholarship to people. But it's interestingly, that idea of the metonymy is not what young people coming to Yiddish largely gravitate towards. They're seeing Yiddish as something new and exciting and vibrant and a creative space. But the metonymy is this is the subject of my book. So this is where the Yiddish language is a stand-in for something. Because if you're looking at Yiddish from a theoretical perspective and Yiddish use, people use words like post-vernacular and Yiddish as a signified instead of a signifier. Basically, when we use Yiddish, why? Is it meant to be funny? Is it meant to evoke the Holocaust? It always evokes something, because none of us need to be speaking in this language or creating in it or inserting it into cinema or works of fiction. We may be doing it intuitively, and when I say we, I've done a little bit of creative work in Yiddish and also used Yiddish as part of that. But the critics, people coming in from the outside, will say why. And Leah and I had a very interesting conversation this week, because I'm writing a scholarly article about Yiddish in bilingual English and Yiddish texts. And I said, Leah, why is there Yiddish in your book? How did it come to be? And I was all ready with my theory, and Leah said, it just was. I mean, and artists will often answer with a sense of surprise. Well, of course. It's intuitive, especially if there's a family connection or Yiddish is a mother tongue. But if you go to the artists who don't come from Yiddish backgrounds, who are producing works that have Yiddish, particularly cinematic works, they have so much to say about the Yiddish. They can talk for hours about why they've decided to include Yiddish words or phrases in their works, because they're coming at it from the outside. So that's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in the why, and I am an outsider to this culture. And so that question is interesting to me because I'm constantly grappling with it. Why are we still using this language in these very, very deliberate ways, when for all intents and purposes, we could have functioned in any number of other languages? So what does it mean when we use Yiddish in creative works, literary texts, plays,
Is it different
films?
than another language? I mean, like, why would we, if we're bilingual,
Yeah.
I mean, why would we speak Spanish or French when we could speak English? I mean, is it different than that?
And this is sort of one of the questions, is that the scholars and critics treat it as different.
Yes.
So in the literature, it's different. The filmmakers that I've studied who've made these films that have Yiddish dialogue in them, the filmmakers don't know any Yiddish and they've inserted Yiddish. For them, it's different. There's something special and different about Yiddish because it's got that symbolic or metonymic association, particularly around representations of the Holocaust or forgotten pasts or hauntings, representations of immigrant experiences. And the argument that I make in my book is that, to a large extent, non-Yiddish speakers are cut off from those memories and those representations, that the language provides a sense of continuity and connection to the past. If you were not bequeathed with Yiddish through your family, and there's a sense of rupture there, then there's a sense also of a past that you can't access. At least that's what the filmmakers are doing in a lot of the works that I discuss in the book that I just published on the subject.
Which you should read, and is available as the other books in the bookstore. Now, I want to ask you, sorry, Leah, or Leah, however we prefer. So Rivki touched on something there that, of course, you were going to write with Yiddish in your book. And I wanted you to talk a bit about the haunting of Alta Maisa, who is the Melech Ravitch character, and how that was kind of an epic haunting, really, for you for a while.
Yeah, oh God.
Well, maybe don't go there if it's going to be too
No, it's just I'm trying to synthesize it. There's so much to talk about here, and I also want to touch on at some level, not just Yiddish, but I think if we're trying to universalize what I'm trying to get at in my book as well in terms of language, is that there's a cannibalization of so many small languages in the world now. And in fact, I think New York has got I read some article in the New York Times recently that New York has got the highest population of speakers of languages that are endangered, the concentration of them. So for me, when I went to research this book, and I'll come back to your question, I haven't forgotten, I did a trip through to a town called Burdham in the Northern Territory in between lockdowns. A friend of mine's a professor of endangered languages, and he rings me up and goes, Leah, I'm here, I got a car, you want to come? So that was Gilad Zuckerman, he's quite the character. And we did this mad trip down to try and find where Melech Ravitch, to retrace his steps. And along the way, I couldn't write this book without having the okay from the traditional owners. I would not write it. So I made lots of inquiries, and I said, where do I find them? And the people who lived on the land around this town called Burdham were of Yangman traditional ownership. And there's only 50 of them. Well, then there were only 50 of them left. So we turned up at the Mataranka pub and walked in there and said, is X there? And I can't say his name because he's died. And all these people just sort of started gravitating towards us. And this guy came out, and he was, he talked to me about my project and had a look at some photos that I had to show him. And they eventually did Welcome to Country and gave me permission to write the book. But not only that, we were sort of saying goodbye to them and going back to the car, and he just hopped in the front seat and I'll take you there. And so I had this extraordinary experience of travelling with one of the last native speakers of the Yangman language as well. And I thought, not that Yiddish is at that level, but for me, emotionally, for me personally, I didn't have anyone to speak Yiddish to anymore. Now I've gotten away from your question. Melech Ravitch, what was the question?
It was about the haunting of Melech Ravitch.
Okay, so Melech Ravitch, for those who don't know, and this is not the story of Melech Ravitch, it's inspired by his story. He was a well-known Yiddish poet in the day in Poland who came to Australia in 1933 and went on this Michiganer trip through the outback to try and find a place for Jewish German refugees to be transplanted. And he could see the writing on the wall back home. He travelled a lot through Europe. And I really wrestled with this story. I first came across his story when I was 15, and my father was in the 6th Australian Employment Company with a guy called Yossel Bergner, who became his very close friend.
Just a guy. Sorry.
Well, it was Yossel, And so when I was 15, Dad took me to meet Yossel, and we went into his studio, and Yossel shows me this photo of his father, Melech Ravitch, and he always used to say, once I start talking about father, I'm pregnant with father, I'll never stop, so I'm a bit the same. And so it inspired me then, but then I wrestled, and Arnold knows this too, down the back, how much I wrestled with this story because of its complexity, because of, the kind of, the lens you could look at in terms of it being a colonial kind of thing. And I didn't know how to approach it. And I tried so many ways, and I cancelled contracts and blah, blah, blah. And in the end, I thought, I don't have to write about Melech Ravitch. He's haunted me enough. And once I'd called him Alta Meisa, which for those who don't know means old story, because I was so sick of Melech Ravitch by then, it took off. So the fiction just let me bring him into being. Yeah, enough said. Schön.
No,
Genug.
so I actually want to usher him into the room a little bit. I'm just going to read one paragraph. Alta had heard the term before, 4x2, rhyming slang for Jew. He'd been called worse, kike, yid, sheeny, shyster, Shylock, Christ killer. He was an instant curiosity wherever he went, a freak in some sideshow, even though he had no belief in God. What still made him a Jew, aside from his bris? A ritual he had no say in as an 8-day-old baby. For Alta, it was language. Yiddish shaped his every thought, awake or asleep, wrapping its silken veil around his heart, coursing through his blood, even if he wanted to. How to exorcise an angel that lived in every muscle and nerve in your being. A language filled with sadness, love, humour and wisdom like none other he knew, and he could speak more languages than most, but it was a language without a home. I'm going to speak about this, but I'm going to take it to Eleanor, because I know she has thoughts about this phrase, a language without a home, what does it bring up for you?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. It's a little bit tied in to what you're talking about, and that the exoticism. I mean, I'm not an academic, but the Holocaust and Yiddish, I think, have been exoticized, or people think it's worth examining in a way as though it's a foreign thing, as though it isn't a contemporary thing, a real thing, a real way for people to speak and to relate. And you know, like the people that like just love to study the Holocaust, they just really, you know, and not just to learn about the Holocaust, but there's something exotic in it. It's perhaps the way people of color are sometimes looked at as exotic and not just like everybody. But so this thing about, we discussed a little bit about Yiddish not having a home, and why do people speak Yiddish if there's no home? To me, Yiddish is home. I mean, to me, Yiddish, if I think home, I think Yiddish, and vice versa. So I don't see it as an outside language or as an outside thing. I mean, it's sad because 6 million Yiddish speakers were killed, and it's sad because Israel decided not to have Yiddish be a language of their nation. And it's sad because I and other Jews dreamed of being tall and blonde. But that, you know, blonde I worked at and I could do, but tall I couldn't do. So, it's sad about Yiddish, but there are people who speak it. You know, neurotic, normal, AB normal people like everybody else, and that's where I sit on the Yiddish question.
But maybe it's also that the idea of without a home is also takes into account its genesis, or it's the way it developed, because it's also symbolic of the wandering Jew, right? It has lots of different parts to it, even though its roots, and we'll talk about the roots a bit later. But I think that maybe that idea of it being transportable and also something that we might carry in our bodies, because I'm thinking you're evoking home is something emotional as well, right? Or it's the histories we carry with us.
But I mean, the minute we start talking, I'm at home. Yeah. I mean, I'm here.
Well, I'm not, because it's a Galiciana Yiddish. That's weird.
Mine is the Czech.
Yeah.
Sorry, aristocracy, apparently.
You know, you go to Mexico and they sprechen, you know, or the Argentinian Yiddish, and it's so schön with a little and an accent, with a, you know, Mexicana accent. I mean, it's so beautiful. It does travel. I mean, yeah.
But I think what you're saying, Rebecca, is really important in terms of where does this leave the youth? Because, you know, my kids don't speak Yiddish, but they go, you know, the first, when they were the little and pretending that they could speak Yiddish, my uncle Zelik was still alive, so he'd speak Yiddish to me. And my daughter just came out with like, bleiben in the Häusen, which means I believe in my pants. I don't know where she got, but she thought that sounded Yiddish. And then, you know, the next stage is she gets out the Duolingo. Hope she's not here, she'll kill me. And starts sort of learning Yiddish on Duolingo, and then learns like, wo ist the zebra? Where's the zebra? So like, where, even if they don't have that,
but it's great, yes.
And it's sort of disconnected from that. How do they then emotionally connect with it? I guess, you know. Sorry, I'm taking up your job.
No, because there's lots of ways, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, it's to me, such an interesting story, because my generation and younger, so I'm born 1973. So my generation and younger, there's a real sense of rupture, and among that generation that has Yiddish-speaking ancestry, a sense of disappointment that the language was incompletely transmitted. And we know the survivors of the Holocaust were in many cases not comfortable speaking Yiddish with their children. They were worried their children would have an accent and it would interfere with their success. And they were traumatized after their experiences and their relocation and the sense of ongoing displacement. So there is this incomplete transmission of Yiddish among its speakers that is just part of the story of the language. And even among Hasidim, if we look at Hasidim, we have something like 1 million Yiddish speakers, regular Yiddish speakers in Hasidic communities across the world. Even there's an incomplete transmission, because most of those survivors did not speak Yiddish to their children when they came to new homes. And the various Rebbes said in the 60s and 70s, we have to turn back to Yiddish because everyone else seems to have vacated the space, and it's a great way to make clear our identity. We have to have clothing, names, and language to distinguish us from everybody else. So there's this sense really of Yiddish in the world as a space of return for many people, and even for my colleagues on this panel, even who are native speakers, a sense of return to Yiddish. And that's, I think, a really interesting feature of the language, but it's also a reason why we have this feeling of haunting in many cases, because there is this rupture, and we're returning, but what are we returning to? What are we uncovering? What's there? What are the secrets? What is the potentially esoteric knowledge that lies associated with Yiddish? And I think that's a theme that we find in a lot of creative works where Yiddish is included.
I want to speak about the notion of the supernatural looms large, which is in your book, and the way that Yiddish roots emerge from Lashon Kodesh. Is it possible that this makes the language more amenable to housing the otherworldly or ineffable, do you think, Rifki?
I think the perception of Yiddish and its associations with the Holocaust, which is a haunted space, and its associations particularly with contemporary Hasidim, encourage a lot of creative activity around the supernatural. Because at least in the films that I've studied, Hasidim are associated with the authentic carriers of Jewish knowledge. And that Jewish knowledge is mystical knowledge, it's Kabbalah. So it's how we speak to the dead. How do we deal with the Dibbuk? So somebody who inhabits somebody else's body. And in the films that I've looked at, generally in a horror movie kind of way, but not always. And so Hasidim, who are Yiddish speakers, are seen as authentic carriers of this esoteric knowledge, this Jewish textual knowledge that in many cases has also been incompletely transmitted. So whereas historically Yiddish speakers may have been associated with Talmudic studies and mastery of these Jewish texts, today that isn't necessarily the case in contemporary Jewish life. So who holds that authentic knowledge? Who can speak with the dead? Who can speak with the various levels of beings? Who do we call when there's a Dibbuk, when there's a authentic Jewish monster that appears? Well, the filmmakers and in many cases fiction writers seem to think that Yiddish is a conduit for this knowledge. And so my argument is that there's this association of Yiddish with the supernatural for that reason, is because it is this space. If we say Yiddish, yes, we think, Yiddish is funny. You might think Seinfeld. If we do the intonation, Yiddish intonation, the sing-song cadence, people might intuitively laugh, but people might also intuitively say, that's mystical knowledge, that's Kabbalah, that's these texts, that's monsters. And the Dibbuk has become just another monster in pop culture. So we have Dracula, we have Frankenstein, we have King Kong, and we have the Dibbuk. And the term is so widely and casually used now in pop culture that some people forget that there's that Jewish origin story, but creatively, people are also interested in re-Judaizing it and making that a Yiddish-speaking story.
I'd like to usher us towards the Kaddish and the Yizkor, and I know both prayers are not composed in Yiddish, but I wonder if the ritual of saying the Kaddish, the prayer for the dead, which is literally a sanctification of God, a ritual which provides us with a long-used mechanism with which to house the dead even when they have not been afforded a burial, and perhaps that this extends to our relationship with Yiddish when it is not purely reduced to this elegiac sense. Now there's a scene in Doll's Eye where Alta is speaking to Anna about Rosh Hashanah, which is about to come in that evening, and he tells her about Yizkor, which he explains as a prayer for remembrance, where we call out the names of our dead. It's a nice custom to acknowledge the presence of those we've lost, she reflected. You think so? To my mind, it's ridiculous. Do you really think the dead are listening, or that anyone can see them? I guess you need to know how to look, Anna responds. Maybe before I turn to Eleanor about her experience of saying Kaddish, I'd like you to speak a little bit about Altamisa at that point.
Gosh, he was a very complex character, and I think part of his and I play with the whole idea of eyes, and doll's eye is a reflex that doctors use to see whether someone's actually conscious, and so the whole idea of are we really seeing what we look at is what the whole book is about. And so Alta is very much a kind of, his vision literally is to look to the future, to look at the possibilities, to look at the horizon, to move forwards on this landscape along the train tracks of Australia to avoid the train tracks of Europe. And so he's very outward looking and very practical in his way. And he has all the hauntings of Yiddish literature. He was breastfed Yiddish literature. But he's very much a man of the future. Whereas the other protagonist, who's a young German woman who's fled Germany for different reasons, she's not, well, I leave it to the reader to decide if she's Jewish or not. But for all intents and purposes, she is not. She's fleeing a Germany in the 30s that is becoming very complicated, and she collects dolls. Her father is a chauffeur who works for a famous German ophthalmologist who has a lot to do with Hitler when he's in jail in Landsberg, writing Mein Kampf. It gets very complicated, but basically she is fleeing a world, and she's very much going to Eckwelt, to the ends of the world, and finds herself in this little town called Burdom at the end of the railway which they were trying to build across from Darwin to Adelaide. And she's working in the pub there. There was a pub. And this is all based on true stories. And there she meets Altamisa, who's come up on the mail truck up from Adelaide and is sort of headed towards Darwin. And they meet in this little town and are thrown together as unlikely kind of characters who find love together. She's very much focused inward and focused in the past and in what was and in small things. So she's very interested in doll's eyes and in doll's makings and how things are made up. And this is a contrast, I guess, in a metaphorical kind of way I'm trying to draw. Again, I'm not answering your question, am I? I could almost be speaking in Yiddish. I'm like going around in circles.
That's his resistance, is that
Yeah.
because for, I don't know, you tell me if I'm wrong, is it that he seeks to enliven Yiddish so that it is part of the future. So it's not that he sees it as something of the past.
Yeah, but he's trying, I mean, in a way he sort of, he feels like, he talks about Yiddish being its kroch and a phoenix, and it's got sort of feathers of Russia, and it's sort of a pastiche. And so he's trying to find it a new home because he feels like he can see writing on the wall back there, and he's trying to create an enclave here, which has all its own problems that we won't even get into. But I think that's...
Eleanor, will you tell us a bit about your experience of saying Kaddish? So there's one experience in the Letters Project, which you write about. And there's another one which you speak about in terms of being part of Yentl.
I mean, first of all, women weren't supposed to say Kaddish. So this was already saying Kaddish. I mean, you know, my family people died when I was young, and I wanted to say Kaddish, but nobody cared if I wanted to say Kaddish because girls, women don't say Kaddish. So Kaddish always meant something special to me. We did Yentl when I was with the Folksbiene. We did the play Yentl, and I played Avigdor, Yentl, who was a girl who wanted to be a boy so she could study. And I wanted to be a boy. I wanted to be a boy so I could play sports, so I could study, so I could say Kaddish, so I could do everything that boys could do. And for this part, I got to say Kaddish in public. And so it was, for me, one of the best roles I ever had, because I got to do that which I had raged against not being able to do. And in the book, I go to a memorial in Stuttgart, the Transport Memorial, and by coincidence, my father's first wife, and first daughter, who were transported to Ishbitza in 1942 and killed sometime between April and November. That in one of a surprise moment for me, their names, without my knowing that they would be there are those names: Hannah Schlisselberg, Frieda Schlisselberg. And Frieda Schlisselberg is my half sister, I realize. And I think, well, okie dokie. I think I remember my Kaddish from Yentl, and I don't know when the last time anyone ever said Kaddish for them. I mean, my father was dead since 1976, so it was, easily 40 years since anyone ever said Kaddish for these people, my family, and so I did. But indeed, it's Hebrew, yeah.
I've just been very rudely, not rude by the woman who told me that we have 5 minutes. How is that possible? There is so much I would like to continue to talk about with you. Could we just pretend that we can continue this session? I will give it up for 1 or 2 questions, depending on how good they are, and then maybe I will go back to 1 more question, because I really am refusing for this to be over. Are there any questions? Do you want to? Okay, no questions. I think people are. Oh, there is.
I don't know if there's a microphone or can people hear me? I just wanted to,
And we can always.
just wanted to mention and kind of question that famous tension between Menachem Begin and Isaac Bashev, a singer. The singer writes about in his Nobel laureate essay where, the question Eleanor touched on, why isn't Yiddish the national language of Israel?
Look what you've started.
I want to jump in. There. Can I take a slightly different slant on this? Because I grew up speaking Yiddish in a Yiddish environment, but I wasn't part of the Yiddishist community, and neither were my parents. So I don't have a political kind of bone to play in this. But I came back to speaking Yiddish when I lived in Israel and worked in Israel for 10 years, because I could finally understand those bastard little words in there that I never understood. What's Raboina Shaloilim? Didn't have a clue what it meant. I just said it like a parrot. And once I learnt the Hebrew and understood what I was actually saying, where does Misa come from? Where does, all those little sort of embroidered words, I actually embraced the language more. So that's just one other, I know it's not what you're getting at, my husband and I used to drive around when everyone was emptying out their boidems in Haifa and collect all the Yiddish books, yes. But,
And Rifki, there's one of the films that you talk about that's set in Israel. I mean, there are a few set in Israel, but that really is the father's house.
Yeah, dem Tatenspacedienststube, Homeland. Yeah. So there's a film that was made in 2009 by a filmmaker named Danny Rosenberg, who's an Israeli filmmaker, and of that third generation where the incomplete transmission returns to Yiddish, where he had Yiddish-speaking grandparents, his parents weren't Yiddish-speaking, and then in that third generation, so many Israelis have gone and studied Yiddish and connected with Yiddish, as well as Ladino and other Jewish languages. Because as we know, you create a new country, there's going to be a hegemonic language. You need to be able to function and run a post office and an army. And so there is generally going to be one language that dominates until things settle down and you have a way of working, and then you can have multiple languages together. And for Yiddish, this was shocking because it's the exact moment that the Holocaust survivors landed on the shores and were told, no, this is not the language we're functioning in. You're going to have to shelve it. And there are scholars who've done work looking at the psychological impact. Yael Haver is a scholar who's written on the psychological impact of forgetting language. And it's not just Yiddish. There are other languages where you're told you have to forget the language and speak the dominant one. We're trying to create a life, a viable life. And so there's been this really interesting return. And so Danny Rosenberg learned some Yiddish and then made this film called Homeland, Beit Avi, where he's looking at 1948, the War of Independence in Israel, and he has these two Yiddish-speaking characters, one of whom is tanned and Hebrew-speaking, and he's this sort of senior mefaked in the army, and then he has this sort of Nebuchi, Holocaust survivor who's just gotten off the boat, and he finds himself in this outpost, and they're together. And it's a fascinating, amazing film because it deals with the trauma of forcibly submerging language in order to adopt an identity that feels viable in a forgiven moment, in a particular moment in time. And then what happens when 2-3 generations later, there's a generation that feels safe and comfortable and confident and acculturated, and they then have the luxury to go back. Because in some cases, Yiddish is a luxury. It's something you return to from a place of safety. And that, in a sense, is a privilege. And I feel that privilege. I feel privileged that I'm comfortable. I don't feel oppressed in my Yiddish. I feel very safe and supported by people like everyone in this audience who came to hear this talk. Yiddish is now a safe and creative and vibrant space. And sometimes we forget that it wasn't always true. And people in this room, I'm sure, have experienced that, the attempt to submerge language in your world and what that does and how that feels.
One more, and it is that I want, if you have any writer or film or maybe it's a musical or whatever it is that you can throw at the audience and they will write it down, or commit it to memory, and that they will go out and just soak it up as a return to something. Or Eleanor, for you, maybe it's an anecdote of singing Yiddish somewhere where you wouldn't have thought.
The only thing I will say, and this isn't really Yiddish based, so it's wrong that I'm saying it, but it's good for a laugh. I directed Yiddish theater in Israel, and I speak whatever language I please in any way that I do, and for this I'm loved and hated all at the same time. So often from New York, I say Mira, Mira, so directing these Hebrew actors in Yiddish, I direct them in Yiddish, but I also say Mira, and they know, even though they don't know what I'm saying, which in Spanish means look. So after the first rehearsal, the pianist came up to me, this is just an anecdote, which is, came up to me and says, "Why you're calling everyone my wife's name?" There's my Yiddish anecdote.
I mean, you have a whole book of them, but really maybe it's about, seeing into it. Or,
I think that the sort of pearls of wisdom, if you can stomach horror movies, there is such an interesting subgenre of Jewish horror movies with Yiddish. So The Vigil, Attachment, Demon, There are just a few. There are others.
They're in Yiddish?
They have Yiddish, significant spoken Yiddish in them. And if you know Yiddish, they become much more interesting because the subtitles are really dreary and foreshortened. And the Yiddish is just really good. And it's exciting, I think, as a Yiddish speaker, or even a non-Yiddish speaker, to see how Yiddish is associated with this horror movie space. Also bearing in mind that who created the horror movie industry after World War II? Holocaust survivors' children. Right, so that's the beginning of that whole industry. So if you can stomach horror movies, I encourage you to go out and watch the ones with Yiddish in them. They're
And I would have
fascinating.
thought no until I read your book.
I put in a plug for Mendele Moiches Svoirim, Benjamin III, which is the sort of Yiddish Don Quixote, which inspired me a lot in writing Doll's Eye. But also, I enjoyed writing this book so much because I went back to all the expressions and all the insults in Yiddish. And they are gems, they are just philosophy. So, I start the book with Das Oig is so klein, doch sieht es die ganze Welt. So the eye is so small, but it sees the entire world. But there's also, I can't remember how it actually goes in Yiddish, maybe you guys know, about that beautiful insult about may you swallow an umbrella and may it open inside your stomach. Something like
I've never
that.
heard that.
Oh, it's bad. The insults. So I'm going to encourage you to just go and look at all the insults because they're just gold.
Please give a rousing thank you to Eleanor, Leah, and Reissa. All their books are in the bookstand run by the Avenue Bookstore in the Hub. They will delighted to sign the copies. A Shane and Dank to you all.